Hi everyone, in this video we'll go over the practice known as guard clauses, sort out the difference it has with validation and when to use which, as that was my first question when I initially heard about guard clauses. So what really is a guard clause? A guard clause is a technique that would let you fail fast if a method does not validate a condition and immediately stop the code execution. So in short, you fail fast typically by throwing exceptions. Just by hearing this part, it should be obvious that both guarding and validation provides a solution to a similar problem, but it's not that simple. On the surface, it might seem that they deal with the same situation, but it's not the case. The difference is the small nuance in exceptions. Let me elaborate a bit. Usually we throw exceptions whenever there is something exceptional happening in our system. Now, is an invalid user input exceptional? Hardly. You would usually expect users to find ways to screw things up. So, for example, let's take this method that I have right here that adds a book. Basically, you need the author, the name, and the price. So, in real world, if the price is 0 or negative, you should fail, or you should return a validation error to the end user. You are not going to find code like this in your API methods structure. Basically, this is a bad user experience, and this situation is better handled by validation. Basically, you would have something like an add book request in here and just send the parameters to the service. Basically something like this, and have inside the add book request validation rules for the parameters. Okay, since invalid input is not really exceptional, you would not add guard clauses or throw exceptions in here. When you would do that? You would do that when your books controller depends on the book service, since you wouldn't be able to add the book itself if the book service was invalid or null. Basically, your controller could not work with that. The simplest way out would be to have some code like this. If book service is null, throw new argument null exception, name of book service. Yeah, this is good, but this will get out of hand when you'll have more than one service injected, or you'll have some options or something like that. So in C# we could just join the null checks with an assignment. Basically, you would inject the book service, validate that it's not null, and if it's null, you would throw an argument null exception in here. Okay, so far so good. We have our validation for the add book request, and we are validating that our books controller has a valid service, a valid instance of the iBook service. For me to show you where this approach would not really work anymore, we need to go to the books service that I have in here. As you can see, this is pretty similar to what we had before, but if you take a look a little bit below, we can see that I'm using the API key value from the configuration itself. So for that, we need to validate it, since it shouldn't be a white space or an empty string. So we would add something like this: string is null or white space, configuration value API key. Throw new argument exception, API key should not be empty. Yeah, that is cumbersome, since we can't do anything like this line of code right here. And if you check for more than one value from the configuration, you could end up with a pretty long constructor in here. To help us standardize the way we handle this kind of situations, we could use a package named Ardalis.Guards clauses. Okay, the way you would use it is basically something like this. You'd go in here and type guard against null or white space configuration value API key. What this will do behind the scene is run a similar check to this. Basically, it will check if the configuration is null or white space for the API key and throw an exception in here. So since we have this in place, we no longer need this part in here and this part in here. Another thing that the guard would need is basically you could provide the parameter name, and as well you could specify a custom message that you would like to show to the end user. For example, you can type in here something like null or white space API key provided for book service configuration. Something like this, and the guard clause would throw an exception at this point and short circuit the method to add the book before the HTTP client is created and the resources are allocated in here. We could do the same inside the book service itself. Basically in here you could transform this line of code into guard against null book service, name of book service, which will basically guard you against a null book service in here. An idea that you might have at this point is that you would use the guards in cases of infrastructure, like resolving dependencies, making sure your services are correctly injected. Basically, that is right, although you could perfectly use guards in cases of business validation. If we take, for example, a DDD approach, you could have this book class right here, which would have something like this. Basically, you would validate that the author is not a null or white space, the name of the book is not null or white space, and the price is not lower than 0. What we can do here is basically refactor these lines of code into something like this. So the author would equal guard against null or white space author, name of author. So this line of code we could refactor it to this. You would have guard against null or white space name of name, and we could refactor the price as well, so we could guard against 0 or negative, and we would get the same result, just with the fewer lines of code and having it look clearer. At this point, you can see that our code looks clearer than it was before, and with fewer lines of code, we are getting the same results. One specific thing I forgot to mention is the fact that there are essentially two types of guarding practices. The one that we've covered so far is called the precondition checks, and there is one more that's called postcondition checks. From what I can say, the postconditions are not that common. Basically, the places where you might find them is in dealing with a service that is not reliable. From experience, I'd say that this is a less probable scenario for you to encounter, but nevertheless you should know that there is a practice that deals with unreliable services. Another thing is basically the guard clauses can serve as a sanity check of your unit tests. If you forget to satisfy certain dependency, You'll know exactly why the code is failing, instead of some random error caused later in the code, once that dependency is actually attempted to be used. In short, it's one of those cost-benefit decisions. Basically, how much effort does it take you to add some guard clauses, which are actually pretty valuable things when it comes to tracking down bugs and just maintaining your code in general.